Hello. This is Will Tushinsky, and this is my incredible macroeconomics presentation. Let's get into it. So, macroeconomics is primarily concerned with two main subject areas, and that would be the factors affecting the long run of the economy, such as standard of living. And the long run is defined as the period when the market is in equilibrium, so when supply and demand are typically in line. And the causes and consequences of short-run economic fluctuations, especially unemployment and inflation. In the short run, again, there is the period in which other effects such as price stickiness can prevent equilibrium, for example. Fantastic. The business cycle is the real output fluctuates cyclically, alternating periods of growth and decline, and typically trends upwards over time, just in general. So there are certain points on the business cycle graph that are especially important. The expansion, which is the increase in real GDP to a peak, downturn, decrease in real GDP to a trough, recession, downturn of at least 2 quarters, and a depression, which is a steep, prolonged recession. I highly recommend just getting this graph down. This is a good reminder of just the basic idea of a business cycle. The labor force. The labor force includes everyone who has a job or actively sought one in the last 4 weeks, but in particular, it excludes those younger than 16, people in jail or in the military, and discouraged workers, which is a worker who did not look for work or did not work in the past week or look for work in the past 4 weeks. The average labor productivity is equal to the GDP divided by the number of workers, which is typically just how much workers can produce, and you'll see this pattern a lot. GDP divided by blank to determine anything per capita. Labor productivity depends on physical capital, for example, machinery, human capital, like per se experience or like years in a certain field, natural resources, technological knowledge, and the political and legal environment that is in a particular area. Unemployment is for the USAD. It's classified into 3 forms: the structural mismatch of skills spurred by changes, which would be 0 if retraining was instant and free, factors into the natural rate of unemployment. Number 2, cyclical unemployment, which is unemployment resulting from the business cycle. It increases in recessions, and it does not factor into the natural rate of unemployment. And then frictional, which is caused by time lag between jobs, say like you're looking for work or you're changing locations or whatnot. And frictional unemployment is inevitable and part of the natural rate of unemployment. GDP. Feel free to pause if I go too fast. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. In terms of that definition, there's a lot, I guess, to break down. The market value is the total value of different goods within a certain area, and dollar value, of course, of all goods. That only includes the final goods, and capital goods counted the year that they're produced. So nothing before or after a particular time. And produced within a country, of course, implies that they're domestically, even if not by a domestic firm, the goods have to be made domestically. And then if in a given period of time, that's usually a quarter or a year. And then a good thing to remind yourself of is just total production is equal to total consumption, which is equal to total income. Awesome. So the GDP components and the GDP equation. The equation at the top is y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. And you're going to see these come up a lot, so I highly recommend jotting them down now. C is the purchases of final goods by customers. It stands for consumption. These goods are typically durables, long-lived goods, non-durables, which are goods used up quickly, as well as services, which are intangible goods. I is firm spending on capital and real estate. The I stands for investment. This is business fixed, things like capital equipment, things like new homes and apartment buildings, as well as inventories. And so things that haven't been sold or things that have been placed into storage for a later sale, they fall under the investment category of the economic equation. Government spending is G. That's pretty self-explanatory. Pretty much everything the government pays for, including, I believe, labor, goods, and services, falls under the G category. And then the net exports, which is NX, which is, of course, exports minus imports. You have a surplus if the exports are greater than the imports, which is typically results in a higher GDP, or a deficit if the imports are greater than the exports, which is followed by a lower GDP, typically. Oops. Excuse me. All right. Inflation and GDP. Actually, I feel like I should go back. It's important to note what's not included. Intermediate goods, which are defined as goods used to produce other goods, like machine parts, is the value is only reflected in the final good. So it doesn't count any process that took to get there. That doesn't really count. It's only the value of the final good that matters. Goods not sold on the open market, for example, like black market, of course that doesn't count because that's not officially by a firm or legal. Used goods, which was the value was counted when it was sold new, that doesn't count either. Things like thrift store goods, that doesn't count. And then transfer payments, which is moving money between the government and people, especially things like Social Security fall under transfer payments. None of these are included in GDP. And GDP ignores the fact that certain activities deplete natural resources, pollute, or have other costs. So it's purely looking at the financial aspect of an economy or of a certain place. There are also a bunch of trickier things that they will try to get you on. For example, homes are personal investment, so that falls under the I category. Not consumption, because it's not seen as a reusable good. If a good does not sell in the given period, it enters a firm's inventory and is counted as an investment. For example, if it doesn't sell by a certain quarter, by a certain time period, it is counted as an investment. And a good in inventory sold in a later year does not enter that year's GDP, as it was counted as inventory. So that's just saying if I had a good from 5 years ago and I sold it now, it doesn't count, really, because it was in inventory. Okay, inflation and GDP. Inflation is an increase in the aggregate price level, or equivalently, a decrease in the value of money. And then a good differentiation between real GDP and nominal GDP, because you're going to see those used very specifically and later on. Real GDP is using the base year and indicates real growth in a particular year. And nominal GDP uses current prices, and that includes inflation. So sometimes it's often better to look at real GDP, or if you want to get maybe a more accurate perspective on it, especially if it's from a long time ago, you might want to look at nominal GDP. Real GDP per capita is equal to the real GDP per worker multiplied by the fraction of the population that is employed. So that's just GDP divided by the amount of people that are employed, and that all that really tells you is the contribution of each worker to the real GDP. Most differences in GDP per capita can be explained by differences in average labor productivity. So that's just pretty self-explanatory. The harder you work, the more difference you're going to make in the GDP. So, yeah. Measuring prices The Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates the Consumer Price Index each month by comparing the prices of a basket of goods. This is typically like how the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates it, I guess. So the Consumer Price Index formula is cost of basket in year one divided by the cost of said basket in the base year times 100. So that's just getting a percent change. It's also important to note in 1996, economist Michael Boskin, I believe, found the CPI overstated the rate of price inflation by 1.3% a year. So he found that the CPI isn't totally reliable, and then that gets into the advantages and disadvantages of the Consumer Price Index. So the advantages is it can be used to measure the cost of living, which will be useful for like Social Security or benefits and like unemployment checks and stuff like that. It captures changes in the price for basic consumer goods, so which I guess keeps track of that microeconomic idea of inferior or superior goods. And it makes inflation rate easy to calculate, which is always a benefit. Disadvantages, of course, new goods and services enter the market often, and so it doesn't really keep track of that, and doesn't really keep track of changing in taste. It doesn't account for substitution bias, so that idea that people will buy a superior good if they get an increase in wealth, or an inferior good if they get a decrease, it doesn't really account for that, or people will substitute if they have any kind of change to their income. It doesn't account for that. And it doesn't account for changes in quality or consumer taste. The GDP deflator is shown by the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP times 100. That just corrects for the inflation and the nominal GDP. Excuse me. So that really doesn't do too much. But compared to the consumer price index, the GDP deflator is less volatile. It also differs in two different ways. It has only the GDP deflator has only domestically produced goods, while the CPI does include imports, and the deflator weights prices by production to adjust to changing consumption patterns. So the deflator is probably going to be more accurate in some ways. For example, the consumption patterns of certain people, whereas the CPI will be better for looking at the combination of imports in the economy as well. Money supply, 'cause believe it or not, people can buy and sell money. Money is something accepted as a payment for goods and the settlements of debts. That is just the base definition of money. It can be really anything, any kind of agreed upon currency. It's used as a medium of exchange, which eliminates the need to barter, which requires a double coincidence of wants. So it eliminates that. It is a unit of account, which measures the relative value of goods. So any good can have a set price, that's a very convenient thing. And it is a store of value, which lets us maintain wealth over time. So it's not just a something that'll expire or something that will completely depreciate. It lets us maintain it over time. There are two types of money. It's commodity money and it says flat. I think it's fiat money. Commodity money has value outside of just being money. For example, it has other uses, such as gold. Gold is a type of currency that can also be used for other things, such as jewelry. Let me see. People can barter with cows. That's a type of commodity money. If you're in jail, things like cigarettes and ramen noodles, those are commodities in addition to being money. So they have a variety of uses. And then flat money is valuable because the government says so, and we believe it, and that's it. Typically, money had value because it was backed by the gold standard, but that's for a later date. The money supply is all liquid assets in an economy that can be exchanged for goods. And liquidity in particular refers to how easily money can be converted. For example, if you have an asset that is a car, that's not going to be totally liquid. It's going to be more liquid than, say, a house or something like that, because it's more easily converted into straight money than a house, because it's easier to find a buyer and a seller. So let's continue. The trade in money. So there's the saving, which is the difference between what is earned and spent, and that's typically can be seen as S in some equations, but we'll get to that. Investment is the purchase of new capital equipment, like a factory or something. Financial institutions coordinate saving and investment decisions in financial markets. So there's like firms that'll help you choose what stocks and bonds to buy. And then a financial intermediary is an actor that links two other parties in a financial transaction. So that's, I guess, the middleman. If you buy stocks off like some kind of app like M1 Finance or like Robinhood or something, it's like that. For example, a bank receives deposits made by people who wish to save. Banks pay their depositors a rate of interest and charge borrowers an even higher rate for loans. So that's just being an intermediary between people and their money, as well as interest and loans. So, yes, I did. Investment options, and this is in general, or the entire topic of the Fed. There's bonds, which is defined as the certificate of what the borrower owes the bondholder. For example, there were, most famously, there were war bonds during World War II, which allowed people, I guess, to profit, as well as the U.S. military to profit, because they got more funding, and then people could get money back if they bought a particular bond. It is, I guess, the type of class that it's put into is a debt finance, because it's technically a debt on behalf of the bondholder. The profit comes from the purchaser receiving principal and interest in addition to that, and that's where, I guess, people make money. The risks are that interest rates change and the borrower may default, which means they may back out and you may not really have anything. It's kind of like saying you're good for it, which is why a lot of bond people have contracts and a lot of other hoops you have to jump through. And then, in addition to that, the date of maturity is equal to the date they have to, I guess, repay said bond. Stocks are defined as a share of ownership in a firm. Is the specific class is equity finance, as opposed to something being more direct. The profit comes from an increase in stock value and dividends. So if a company makes money, you make money. It is riskier than bonds, because there's nothing really saying that that the bondholder has to pay back in terms of stocks, because the company doesn't necessarily have to be like, hey, stockholders, sorry, we lost all the money, we'll pay you back. Like, no, it's they don't have to do that. And then the means of doing so is sold on stock exchanges, or in the modern era through finance programs and other apps. It's a lot easier to be involved with stocks nowadays. Okay, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, is the United States Central Bank. It contains 12 district banks, and it sets monetary policy and manages banks. And it is the lender of last resort to other banks to maintain stability, to ensure that the entire U.S. economy doesn't collapse because all the banks failed. It's really a last defense, and it's like the be-all, end-all of banks. Federal Open Market Committee manages money supply and open market operations. And it's less important, but it's made up of 7 rotating governors, president of the New York District Bank, and president of 4 other district banks. And if we want to go into it, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is located in D.C., and is directed by a presidentially appointed chairman. So, I guess if that comes up, there you have it. Monetary policy. The Federal Reserve can use the monetary policy to stimulate or slow down the economy, and the way it does this is through expansionary monetary policies, such as which increases money supply and aggregate demand in the short run. But that does kind of risk inflation in doing so. And then contractionary, which decreases money supply and lowers aggregate demand in the short run. Monetary policy has three goals, which is price stability, full employment, and economic growth. But it's impossible to achieve all three simultaneously. So it's really just like what is in the need of most aid at a particular time. Methods of enacting monetary policy. You have open market operations, which is buying and selling securities that inject money into the economy or take it out. If you sell securities, you take money out of circulation. If you buy securities, you inject money into the economy to get it up and going, to get more circulation. But then again, that does risk inflation. You got your discount rates, which is the interest rate the Fed charges banks for loans. It's changed infrequently by the Board of Governors. And then the federal funds rate, which is the overnight rate charged on loans between banks. Not directly set by the Fed, but it is influenced. And then both discount and federal funds rate, increasing the interest rate, which decreases the money supply. So I guess it takes money out of the economy. And then you got the reserve requirement, which dictates how much of its deposit a bank must hold in reserve, which increasing the reserve requirement decreases money supply, because it basically just means that banks have to have more backup cash in case the economy falls through. And then you got bank runs, which bank runs are when depositors rush to a bank to withdraw their deposits, and banks only hold reserves equal to a fraction of their liabilities. So bank runs are typically what caused a bunch of the economic panics and troubles in like the 19th century. I believe there are a few more later on. But yeah, that's whenever a series of depositors withdraw from a bank, it's especially in a massive group, it's devastating for the economy. International capital flows. In an open economy, domestic savings do not need to equal domestic investment due to these capital flows, which there are two types. There's foreign direct investment, which is a company or individual acquires and manages assets in a foreign country, such as an airport in Belgium. So that's like run by British people. And then you also have portfolio investments, which is an individual or company purchases stocks or bonds issued by a foreign corporation but does not directly manage it. For example, someone who just owns something really only in name, and then someone else completely manages it. At the top, you do have another equation to, I guess, determine savings and investment in aggregate supply and demand, which is, this is, of course, assuming the economy in question is closed to trade, because if it's open, it can't really determine that. And that's the GDP is equal to Y, equals to C plus I plus G. And then it also works that I is equal to Y minus C minus G, which is equal to national savings, or S, like I brought up earlier. I highly recommend that you just jot down as many of these variables as possible, because trust me, they get worse. Okay, net capital output. Net capital output, or NCO, is the purchase of foreign capital or financial assets by domestic residents minus foreign purchase of domestic assets. So that's basically just the average, I guess, cost spent on a domestic asset. In an open economy, NCO is equal to the net exports, because they should be equal. But in a closed economy, the savings is equal to the investment. So, I mean, there's not really too much to that. It's just kind of a logistical reasoning, and it can often make those equations simpler if you're given stuff like in an open or closed economy. Savings can differ from investment only as much as the difference is offset by net capital outflow, as defined by that up above. So, for example, that S equals I plus NCO. It's really reliant on that. That also S equals I plus NCO also works in an open economy to determine savings or determine net capital output. But because both of those equations are true, it's so reliant on NCO that the difference is offset by it. So I understand that's confusing, and I probably worded it horribly, but I highly recommend looking at the cram kit. I'll say that right now. Alright, financial markets. The financial market features the supply and demand for savings, and equilibrium is reached by adjusting the real interest rate. So, financial market features supply of savings, demand for savings or investment. As you can see, the real interest rate decreases, the savings supply increases, and the investment demand does so as well. And rather than looking at it as the amount of a certain good, you can just look at it as money. A lot of these concepts in macroeconomics can be replaced or dumbed down to microeconomic levels, which is very helpful. Typically, the real interest rate is the price of a loan, which that's just a true statement, and it determines how much borrowers pay for a loan and how much savers earn for loaning their money in a particular loan. So the savings is the effect of the interest rate on the financial market graph. Supply, higher the real interest rate, the more saving, which is higher supply. And demand, the lower the interest rate, the more investment inside the financial market. The money market, which is, again, very, very, very similar, believe it or not. The aggregate price level is the level of prices for the entire economy, and the value of money is determined by the interaction of supply and demand. That's just a fundamental idea. Money supply depends on decisions of the Federal Reserve and banks, and is inelastic in the short run, and it is set by the Federal Reserve. Demand depends on how much wealth people want to hold as money. It relates to the volume and prices of transaction, which means that if the real level of economic activity stays the same, doubling prices should double demand for money, thus, I guess, weakening the power of said money. The long run, again, is the time to take to reach equilibrium in the market for money. And as the price falls, the value of money increases. So, for example, if the price of milk, let's say it's like $5, and it goes down to $1, money has a lot more value now because it has a lot more buying power and it's a lot more powerful as a result. Because $1 can get you a lot more after the price change. The equation of exchange is more fun variables. MV equals PQ. M being the money supply, V being how often a bill is used. This is also called velocity. So, if that helps, hey. The aggregate price level is P, and Q is the total output or quantity. And then a few rules with this equation. V and Q are generally constant. An increase in M increases P. That is kind of like common sense. If P and Q or V and Q are constant, that increasing one increases the other. Of all the variables, P is dependent, so P is the most, able to change. V and Y are usually fixed for the long run, so changes in P depend on changes in M. So that's, again, just kind of common sense looking at that equation. Increasing one is going to change the effect of increasing the other. The amount of money spent is equal to the amount of money used. Again, that's just putting the same thing in different words. And PY is equal to the nominal GDP, which is equal to MV. So Y and Q can often be exchanged if you're trying to determine the nominal GDP. Long-run neutrality is an implication of this equation, not equatio. This equation of exchange. And it holds that changes in the money supply have no bearing on real quantities because they're both independent of one another. Right, the circular flow model, something that's probably a little easier to grasp, shows how actors in an economy interact with one another. Goods and services go clockwise while money goes counterclockwise. So if you look at all those arrows, that shows the good and services. And if you just draw arrows in the opposite direction, that just shows where money goes because you're paying for said goods and services. Assuming no international trade, the flow equals the GDP. The total flow in the money diagram, so all the arrows going counterclockwise, is the nominal GDP. The total flow in goods and services is the real GDP. New wealth enters the cycle through households. So households is going to be the main source of new income or new wealth. And households provide the human labor used to work, obviously, because that's where people live. So people are going to use labor to create goods. And then land-owning individuals rent their land to businesses. That's just, again, more basic truths of economics. So, two-part structure and stints. Potential output is that which the economy could produce when using all its resources at normal rates. So, think of it as a production possibility frontier, like you learned in Macroeconomics. The potential output, I guess, is along that curve, and that's assuming that all of its resources are being used to the greatest of its ability. An output gap, that is the actual output minus the potential output, and typically that results in a negative number because we've rarely ever used all of our resources to the best of our ability, so it's typically negative and it's typically not a great thing. But when an output gap exists, the economy's resources are not being fully utilized, such as in a recession or a depression or anything where the economy is not doing so hot, where an output gap typically is a sign of that. An economy at full output experiences the natural rate of unemployment, which follows Okun's law. 1% rise in unemployment above the natural rate is equal to a 2% drop in real GDP. So that is just another truth to jot down. That's primarily most of the stuff. Short stints is referred to a short-term departure of the economy from equilibrium. Not necessarily a massive jump away from it, but a short break away from it. And there are two, I guess, different forms of these. And they can be looked as short-run equilibriums. Is an inflationary gap, which is a short-run equilibrium output exceeds the long-run output. This can also be seen as like the economy overheating because it's doing, I guess, too much. And then the deflationary gap, which is the short-run equilibrium output, is less than the long-run output. So I guess the long-run standard, if it's under that, then it's just a certain group is underperforming in a particular subject area. Again, you can tie this back to the production possibility curve or PPF if you'd like, because that definitely makes it a lot easier to visualize. Aggregate demand and supply relates expenditures or production to the aggregate price level. And again, is similar to the microeconomic demand curve. It is based on three major ideas that have an impact on it, which is the wealth effect, which decreases in price level lead to increases in consumption, because again, more people can afford a good and more people can afford to consume it. The interest effect, which decreases in price level, lead to decreases in interest rate, which increases investment because more people are able to invest. And then the foreign exchange effect, which decreases in the price level, make domestically produced goods cheaper in the international market because there is more, I guess, of them. But just like the macroeconomic demand curve, the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, but it's primarily because of these reasons rather than the microeconomic demand reasons. So this is a good depiction of a shift, or just an example of a long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply graph. Government spending does not cause growth, really, just at all. Because an increase in government funding doesn't necessarily increase the amount of people buying a particular good or the amount of good or growth that is temporarily increasing that demand. An increase in aggregate demand will lead to higher price levels, and output, including in the short run. So that's if the graph shifts up and down, it will lead to an increase in AD. But in the long run, aggregate supply will shift inwards, closer and closer towards equilibrium, and that's just how it is. There you go. That's a much better graph for determining the shifts of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Firms respond to demand changes by altering output rather than price, because output is a lot easier, I guess, to manage because price is fairly unpredictable. Changes in the expected aggregate price level shift in the short-run aggregate supply. The aggregate supply shocks shift the aggregate supply curve. Again, most of these are just standard supply-demand graph ideas. Long-run changes affect potential output. For example, population growth, capital stock increase, technology, all of these produce the potential output of a certain good, and therefore it's fairly unpredictable. But typically all of these will lead to an increase in the production of said good. But yeah. Fiscal policy, last little bit here. Fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation to intervene in the economy. And again, they have the same forms as the monetary markets. Contractionary, much like the Fed, decreases aggregate demand in order to curb inflation, and this involves tax increases and spending cuts. It's a type of direct involvement, and it involves, I guess, direct spending in the government, or in the market rather. And then you have the expansionary fiscal policy, which increases aggregate demand in a recession, and that involves tax cuts, spending increases. That's fairly indirect because it's not direct, because it is more abstract per se. And this is involving taxes and subsidies in hopes of intervening in the economy for the better. There are a few downsides to this, though. Government loans drive interest rates up, which make private loans more expensive and can therefore lead to crowding out. Most information about the economy lags, so policymakers may mistime interventions. So it's possible that fiscal policies can get goofed or messed up because they typically don't account for time, or they mess up the amount of information they have about the economy, which can lead to inflation or perhaps even a worse recession, though this is highly unlikely. Alright, thank you very much. Next time around, we'll be getting into the actual Cold War itself. We're done with the vague stuff. Now let's move into specifics. Thank you very much.